So it gives me great pleasure then to introduce today's speaker, Wes Williams, who is Professor of French Literature here at the University of Oxford and a Fellow of St. Edmund Hall. He is also the former director of Torch, that is the Humanities Research Centre here at Oxford. Wes's main interests are in the field of Renaissance literature in French. He has worked in the theatre in Germany for a number of years before returning to academic life, and his work strongly emphasizes the link between research and practice in contemporary theatre, theory, and film. Somewhat relevant to today's talk is his second book, Monsters and Their Meanings in Early Modern Culture, Mighty Magic, which was published by OUP in 2012. And this explores the cultural, medical, and theological significance of monsters from late antiquity to early modernity. Modern political and humanimal monsters are a focus of his most recent work in the field, and it's in that relation he'll be talking to us today. So I'll now hand over to Wes for his talk.
Thank you. I hope people can hear me. Thank you very much, Richard, for that introduction. And I enjoyed the fact that the word humanimal was one that hasn't crossed your lips or come out of your mouth all that often, because it suggests that there is at least something new about this paper, about this discussion. And if one of the things I have done is introduce people to the word humanimal as a kind of subject of research or as a question, I'll be very happy. And I want to suggest today that the humanimal is something that one can play with. And more specifically, something that one can make theatre out of. I'm going to spend the first bit of this talk speaking fairly broadly about the work that I've done over the last 15 to 20 years or so in the theatre, and more specifically at the intersection of research and theatre. And I'm going to start by trying to share my screen in the hope that people can follow this through. So again, I'll take it on trust that that screen has now been shared. There's my opening gambit, if you like, theatre both and in the humanimal world, playing with Kafka in particular. As Richard's just said, I'm a professor of French literature, but I also worked in Germany for a number of years and still work in Germany every now and then. So more broadly, really, I'm interested in European culture. And for me, Europe includes Great Britain. So European culture broadly defined from the Renaissance really through to contemporary experience. Again, as Richard said, most of my theatre work is much more about contemporary experience than it is about Renaissance culture, although it overlaps all the time for me. And that's one of the things I want to sort of try and explain or show how one can play with the texts of the past, ideas of the past, and make them speak to contemporary concerns, but also through doing that, recognize concerns of the past that one might not otherwise have seen perhaps or heard. So I'm going to start by giving an introduction to a range of work in fields that within the university we call knowledge exchange, public engagement with research, creative collaboration, and research and practice or research as practice. There are a number of different ways of talking about this. As director of Torch, as I was for a number of years, it's a language that I learned how to speak more or less and hope to share a little with you today. So now I'm also hoping that this will take me to my next slide. Richard was also kind enough to mention one of my books, the second book, which came out a good 10 years ago now, Monsters and Their Meanings in Early Modern Culture, with the subtitle Mighty Magic. Now, I bring it to attention here because Mighty Magic is, as many of you I imagine will know, a quotation from Othello. It's from Act 1, Scene 3 in particular. And it's that speech in which Othello is hauled in before the court to explain or to account for his seduction of Desdemona. Othello, you will of course remember, is black. Desdemona is an expensively reared white young girl in the Venetian, or young woman in the Venetian structure. And the court can't quite believe that she has chosen him as her potential husband. He explains that what won her was storytelling, and in particular, storytelling about monsters. Quote, the cannibals that did each other eat, the anthropophagi, and men whose heads do grow beneath their shoulders. He calls this storytelling a mighty magic. In other words, he's no witch. He has no magical powers that somehow derive from his African heritage other than his stories. This put me onto something within Renaissance culture more broadly, which is about the power of stories, and in particular, the power of stories that involve monsters. And on the front of that slide, you can see very, very unclearly, but I hope you can see it, not Desdemona, but Andromeda. This is a picture by Paula Rego, who of course died just earlier this year, an absolutely brilliant example of someone who takes ancient myths about monsters and reinvests them with modern energy. She was kind enough to allow me to use this picture of Andromeda on the front of my book. I'm sure it's the only reason for the rarest sales of the book. But what you can see in this picture is a reimagining of the Andromeda myth. In other words, there's a monster at the back. There's somebody greeting the monster there. Is it the mother? There's a young child being prepared. Is that Perseus being prepared to be put on his horse? Or is that the young Andromeda being prepared to be sacrificed before the monster? I'm asking these questions because one of the things that one can do with these kinds of stories, as Othello does, is not only stage them, but ask questions about them. And Paula Rego does this magnificently in this etching, and indeed, in a lot of her work. And she was a kind of inspiration for me in my rethinking of how the mighty magic of monstrous stories in the Renaissance got developed. In that work, it became clear to me that the Renaissance or the early modern period, the 16th to 18th century, is a time in which our understanding, European culture's understanding of itself and itself as human, as distinct from animal or barbaric or monstrous in various other ways, underwent a huge shift. That was partly because of colonization, but it was also because of changes in medical practice and in the philosophical understanding of the self over the course of this period. Very broadly speaking, what this book argues is that monsters moved, if you like, from the margins on the edges of maps and into the self to becoming some kind of constitutive understanding of oneself as monstrous. One of the authors that I work on and teach most, Montaigne, Michel de Montaigne, writes, there is nothing so monstrous in nature as myself. What's interesting about this move is at the same time, this move is sort of conjugated alongside a new attention to animals. Montaigne, again, is one of the sort of pioneers of this in his complex essay, The Apology for Raymond Sebon, which is a big, longest essay of all the essays in his book, about philosophical skepticism, about the various histories of philosophy. There's a moment where Montaigne pauses to think about his relationship with his cat. It's a famous moment now, but it's a moment that's worth spending a little time with. Because Montaigne spends a good deal of that essay, that Raymond de Sebon, trying to find out what it is that makes us specifically human. One way he does this is to argue against the notion that humans are somehow the pinnacle of nature. And one of the primary ways in which he does that is to talk about animals and their capacity for things that we think of as primarily human. Their capacity to, for example, make extraordinary structures, a bird's nest, their capacity to generate music, their capacity to communicate over distance, all sorts of different capacities that animals clearly have are then explored in Montaigne's essay to ask, well, then what's left of us as humans if animals have all of this? And or to then ask, well, is there actually a radical difference between humans and animals? Or might we think of something that you could think of, that you could term as humanimal? Now, this is not an endogenous term. It's not a term that Montaigne generates, but I think his thinking leads us towards it. And one of the ways in which he does this is to think about his cat. So he sat there writing or dictating or in his study, and his cat comes along. And he asks himself, sometimes I wonder if I am not playing with my cat, but my cat is in fact playing with me. In other words, in asking the question about the limit between the human and the animal, or the border between the human and the animal, or communication between humans and animals, Montaigne also asks himself about agency. Who is running this particular relationship, or who has the agency in this discussion, this communication? This is something that I've then been interested in a number of different ways, and not only me. My work in Monsters and Their Meanings forms part of what people have called the animal turn. In other words, a shift in thinking within academic life and in theoretical thinking, but also in historical thinking about the relationship between humans and animals. I've put up on here on this screen just 4 examples of, if you like, landmark moments within the context of my own work, but more broadly about this animal turn. But these are not the only 4 kind of moments that are of interest. In a way, one can think all the way back to the philosopher Mary Midgley. I say all the way back because it's a good 30 to 40 years that Mary Midgley, who again died in the last short while, has been thinking about this question. Her work and the work of others became crystallized in the last 10 to 20 years, I'd say, in a series of moves within critical study, within academic life, within philosophy, across Europe and into the US, certainly, and then more broadly across the world, that we call the animal turn. In other words, a turn in scholarship towards thinking about animals. The 2 sort of core texts in that turn are the work by Jacques Derrida, The Animal That I Therefore Am. In French, it's a better joke. L'animal donc que je suis. Je suis means I am and I follow. And so Derrida plays with Kafka, amongst others, but he plays with the idea that we are following the animals as well as being the animals. And you'll see that on the front of that Derrida's text in English, there's a cat's eye. And that's because Montaigne's scene in which the question of, well, who is playing the game? Am I following the game of the animal, or am I playing a game with the cat? Is one of the places with which Derrida starts to think again about animal identity, human identity, in a sort of argument with Descartes in particular, but with a whole range of philosophers. So that's a kind of particular philosophical moment, if you like, at which animal studies turned into, took up the post-structuralist moment and turned into a kind of questioning of the human in relation to animals. The same year that book came out in translation, J.M. Coetzee, the brilliant South African novelist and thinker, delivered the Tanner Lectures in Human Values in Princeton. And these lectures were entitled The Lives of Animals. In that series of lectures, Coetzee picked up on a strain in his work that had been there since at least Disgrace onwards, in which the cohabitation of humans and animals and the codependency of humans and animals became a theme. He also developed the character Elizabeth Costello, who had been in his work for some long time, and she then becomes a figure who gives lectures in universities about the lives of animals and about our philosophical relationship to animals. Elizabeth Costello is an uncompromising character. She's alive and well in Coetzee's work. His most recent collection, The Pole, has Elizabeth Costello within it, still within it. She is clearly a kind of alter ego for Coetzee in many ways, but with a sort of different a different gender, if you like, or a different way to think about what it is to be a public intellectual, and a public intellectual who is also a performing animal. And there's a lot about Coetzee's way of constructing Elizabeth Costello and the way in which she performs as a writer, including giving lectures in academic situations such as this one, that draws on Kafka. And in particular draws on Kafka's short story, A Report to an Academy. And I'll come back to that report in a minute. First of all, I'm going to pass through Adieu au langage, which is a film, one of the very last films of Jean-Luc Godard, who also died recently. I didn't realize until I put this PowerPoint together that I had quite so many recently died people in part of the discussion. But Godard, of course, has been going for a long time and has an experimenter in film for many, many years. Adieu au langage is a film in large part about the dog that accompanied Godard through the last 30, 20 years of his life. And it's a film that's not a sentimental film at all, but it's a film about how when a character, amongst many things, it's a film about how when a character loses their capacity to speak, they nonetheless continue their communication with the dog, but also how they themselves find themselves treated as if they were dogs. People feed them, people pet them, people don't quite take them seriously enough because they have lost the capacity to speak. This, for Godard, is another way of asking, well, what is it that makes us human? Is it our capacity to language? And if so, what happens when we are dehumanized by the capacity to no longer have the language that we used to? One of the many things that's going on in that film, which is also a love story and is also an experiment in 3D filming. Moving to the left of the screen, you'll see Kafka's Zoopoetics, Beyond the Human-Animal Barrier. This is the first book, it was published in 2020, to really look at how these studies of the animal turn might then find their way into Kafka's work in particular. Anybody who's read Kafka can see what's happening on that front page. It's from the Metamorphoses. It's Kafka's most foundational humanimal story, if you like, with the famous first line, after a night of restless dreams, Gregor Samsa woke up to find himself transformed into a, and then the translations diverge, monstrous beetle, dreadful vermin. It's an Ungeziefer in German, which the is which is important. It's an unbeing. He has been transformed into something that he was not before, and that is now an unbeing. So the transformation into animal in the Metamorphoses is not a happy one. It's a dispossession. It's a loss of capacities which up until that point he had had. Kafka's story has, of course, been read in many, many different ways as an allegory of Kafka's own Judaism, as an allegory of disability, as an allegory of all sorts of different things. We can come back to those either in discussion if people wish to discuss this, or else in later in this talk. I myself will return to Metamorphoses, although the Metamorphoses is not the primary text that I'm most interested in playing with or talking about having played with here. It's the report to the Academy. In other words, it's the interface between a sort of practice outside in the world and a being outside in the world that one might think of as also animal practice, and then somehow integrating that into the Academy, into academic language, into academic life, into research. So I'll now move to my next slide, I hope. Yes. Okay. So I'm now going to take you on a quick tour through the last 10 years or so of work where animals, so there's a little duck, as you can see here, and humans have been working together in various different ways in theatre work that I've done on the edges and with the university. A while ago, I made a show called Storming Utopia here in Oxford with the Pegasus Theatre, which is on Magdalen Road. And it was an intergenerational show. It was also a rock concert. I hope you can see a rock band behind the duck. There were various different iterations of it that went around the world. We went to Venice and we went to various other places. It was a show that tried to make sense, contemporary, local and theatrical sense of a range of early modern utopian texts. It started in 2016 because that was the anniversary of the publication of More's Utopia. And you can see the utopian alphabet down in the bottom right-hand corner of this screen. We began by asking several groups of people that we worked with, what makes an island? How do you recognize an island? Would you like to live on an island? Because the founding myth of Utopia is that it was a peninsula, but then they dug a ditch or they dug a deep enough hole in the sea, if you like, a hole in the land between them and the sea to turn themselves into an island, because they thought by turning themselves into an island, somehow their lives would be better than that of being part of the continent. In exploring Storming Utopia, then we were already looking at borders and the kinds of borders between, for example, what's at the top of this image, which is Palladio's Venice, and what's underneath this image, which is a reflection in water of a refugee camp in Palermo. In other words, how does one is not so much as how is one the other of the previous one, but how do they reflect each other? How are they in fact versions of each other? And what's the border that underlines the difference between, on the one hand, Renaissance splendor, and on the other hand, the line that marks you out as a refugee and whose reflection can only really be caught in the water underneath the buildings. In other words, the borders of the human, the idea of utopia as a separate island nation, translated into modern European policy about refugees, was one of the things that we explored in Storming Utopia. The storm in Storming Utopia is also, of course, a reference to the Tempest, because there are large chunks of the Tempest which are derived not only from More's Utopia, but also from Montaigne's essay on cannibals. Gonzalo in particular, who outlines what he would do if he had government of this isle, repeats more or less verbatim, but of course translated into dramatic dialogue, John Florio's translation of Montaigne's essay on cannibals. Montaigne's essay on cannibals also perhaps gives the name to one of the central creatures of the Tempest, Caliban. It's an allegory of cannibal, and it may or may not, depending, Richard may have more things to say about this too, because of course he's an early modern scholar in this area. It may or may not have come from Montaigne or refer to various island peoples, including, of course, the Irish. Our show that we made, Storming Utopia, went through several versions with several different groups of people. We then revisited it in Oxford with some new performers, with some new renewed hope. And as is often the way when one plays with history, history took over. The Brexit referendum took shape and form, and those words, "this island's mine," that Caliban states, became a statement that many people argued, and of course we had the Brexit vote. In other words, even though we started by thinking, oh, this is in honor of More's old fiction from 500 years ago, by the time we actually made the show again in Oxford with this group of young people and some others, it became about Brexit. One of the things that playing with the past does is makes you realize just the degree to which the past still informs the present and has a bearing on the choices of those who, for example, those in this picture for the most part, who have no vote and who can not really determine their own futures. One of the strongest elements that people in the show under 16, 17, 18 were aware of that was a momentous change happening around them that would alter their lives for at least some long time, but over which they had no agency. Now, I'm not saying they're animals, children, although of course sometimes my children have seemed to be so to me, but rather that they were not given the agency, nor am I arguing for a vote for 14-year-olds, by the way. It's just a way of thinking about agency and the limits of agency that were unexpected to us when we first started making this show. After this show, which was focused in Oxford, I also then got involved with Torch, and we started looking at other ways in which agency and creatures, people, humans who had in the past been considered animal or somehow less than human or less than fully human could find their way into Oxford and into places through theatre that they would not normally belong in. So then this was a project called Finding Our Way, Space Reclamation and the African Caribbean Experience in Oxford, which led eventually to the All Souls Library, the Codrington Library. Codrington's money, of course, is plantation money, and a group of African Caribbean performers from Oxford put on an extraordinarily powerful show in the library, reclaiming, if you like, that space for those for the Calibans and the cannibals of contemporary Oxford still. In other words, there is still work to be done in Oxford today about the kind of reclamation and repair that the culture of early modern Europe has produced and still lives in our towns. Taking a different slant or in a slightly different direction, I've also been working with a different group of scientists. In this case, this was a project called Shaping Destiny, which explored difference and deviation in both genetics and then in cultural representations of the human. I've put these pictures up here because this is a project which was a 2-3 year project, which was multidisciplinary, that went in all sorts of different directions: films, dance, a big theatre show in the old Redcliffe Infirmary, that actually began with this picture on the left, which is a very famous early modern monster, ostensibly born in Ravenna in about 1530, but then made its way right across Europe. It was a child that was born with all sorts of signs on its body. The thing that made the geneticists in particular, who work within the university in the Department of Anatomy and Genetics, most excited was the eye on the knee. Now, that's partly because they work on eyes, and they work on hearts and on cell development and on the head-body axis. And they said, how amazing that anybody thought that you could have an eye on your knee. Not so much because of the displacement simply of the eye from the head down to the knee, but because of all the extra work behind that eye that would have to make it work as an eye. Now, I confess that had not even begun to occur to me when I was looking at these monsters in my monster book. So then we did an exploration into a whole range of different ways of thinking about physiology, anatomy, and genetics, but also the social narratives, if you look to the right of the screen, the social narratives that underpin and that also structure the work that we do in, to the left of the screen, an understanding of the strengths and the limitations of genes in exploring what makes us human. And then in the middle of the screen, you'll see that what we were then hoping to do was to co-create, to understand new ideas across the university, but also with the public, about what it means to be human. Of course, in the last 15 to 20 years, if not 40 years, a scientific account of what it means to be human has dominated much research in the university. And in many ways, we're thankful for that, because it means that when things like COVID come along, the university is ready to play its part within a public sphere to try and mitigate the harm that COVID does, for example. But one of the things that this project, in its small way, tries to do is to recontextualize scientific work within a social structure, so that we don't end up, if you like, reproducing inherited understandings of the difference between humans and animals, between ourselves and other humans, and between the sort of normal human body and other kinds of human bodies. Because, of course, one of the things that this project was also about was what we now call disability, but what early modern people called monstrosity. The other thing that this project did was intergenerational and was fun. And I think one of the key points about playing with Kafka, but also with the whole range of different kinds of research, is to generate an element of fun and an element of collaboration between generations. So here, for example, in the garden behind the current Radcliffe Humanities building, that was, of course, once the Radcliffe Infirmary, you have two nurses having a swift fag between their moments of having to care for people during the COVID pandemic. Now, of course, it's an absurd image in some way. They're doing each other harm, they're doing themselves harm, and they're wanting to somehow break the rules. But at the same time, within the play, those kind of boundaries about what's acceptable behavior were also explored through little scenes like that. How do we expect nurses to be somehow superhuman? Have nurses also got a kind of human sense of fallibility and the need to sort of break out of the superhuman capacity, the sort of beyond the normal capacity that they're given in times of crisis like COVID. So I'm conscious that I'm taking this journey on in quite a number of different ways, but hopefully you're up for two more before we then land back on Kafka for the last 20 minutes or so of this talk. Here, for example, just this week, 2 days ago, yesterday, in fact, yes, a new exhibition or immersive space opened in Oxford in the old NatWest Bank, which derives in part out of my research on monsters, and it's called Fantasy Futures. And without giving too much of it away, it's a sort of journey through contemporary Oxford, guided by some gargoyles who become animate and talk to us and lead us through effectively a climate crisis and various other things, other dangers that face Oxford. It's a visitor experience. It's a collaboration between a group of us in modern languages who work on various kinds of monsters and people who are involved in immersive technology and motion capture. It's another way of playing with figures of the past with absolutely modern and untested, for the most part, technology. And finally, along with Fantasy Futures, just this week, it's a very, very hazy picture on the left. Emily Wolf, who's a performer that I've worked with for many years, as part of the cultural program's consciousness season, she brought a show which we made together called Blizzard, which is a discussion about neuroscience and also embodiment. Within it, within Blizzard, Emily, it's a solo show. She's on stage on her own. She's ostensibly giving a lecture, much as a report to the Academy does, much as Elizabeth Costello does, and ostensibly giving a lecture on neuroscience. But during the course of her lecture, she turns into a number of different animals. Partly in order to ask questions about the kinds of experiments we do on animals when we're establishing neuroscientific knowledge, but also to ask questions about the borders of the human, again in a strange and wonderful performance way. Lastly, in terms of place, of course, there's a new building coming in Oxford, the Schwartzman Centre for the Humanities. Within that building, the humanities will be brought together, and we will have new public spaces in which we might explore these questions through performance. So much of the work that I've just been talking about is part of a sort of broader question about how do you bring performance and research together? What is performance research? How is research in the area of performance different when you conduct it in a university, as opposed to, say, just in a theatre or in a film company? What are the outputs from collaborative performance research projects? And lastly, how can the audience not simply be passive receptors of all of this stuff, but how can the audience themselves be part of the research? That's the kind of questions that I've been exploring for the last 10 years or so, whilst also writing, if you like, standard academic accounts of a range of different things within the early modern period. Which brings us back here then, to Kafka, to lectures about things, to films about things, and to philosophical discussions. None of the four things on this page involve theatre. So theatre is what I'd like to talk about, and how one can play with Kafka theatrically for the last 10 to 15 minutes of this talk. I'll give myself a little pause here and a drink of water, and encourage you once again, if you have any questions, do put them as we go along into the what is it called? Q&A, isn't it? Into the Q&A section of your of the chat. Well, yeah, into the Q&A section, and Claire and Richard will bring them to our attention later. So let me have a glass of water, and we'll talk about more specifically playing with Kafka. Here I've put up two shows, Kafka's Ape and Ed Gochen's Words and Music, which came to Oxford, to the Old Fire Station, as part of the recent Kafka Festival, Oxford Read Kafka, and which I was part of in very different ways. Both of them are playing with Kafka. Both of them draw on Kafka's work, albeit in very, very different ways, and in ways that which I will characterize in a minute and explore in a minute. But before we turn to them in more detail, it might be worth just giving 2 or 3 minutes of introduction for those who aren't already Kafka specialists or Kafka lovers in this discussion, to why animals and the humanimal might be something that you can play with in Kafka. Although animals do not feature prominently in Kafka's novels, The Trial in the Castle, for example, or The Man Who Disappeared, there are actually very few literary authors in whose work animals, he's one of the authors in whose work animals play one of the most memorable and imaginative roles. There's a very brilliant index to Kafka's use of creatures in his writings by Donna Yari, and she points out that non-human and cross-human creatures appear in all of his longer stories and in about half of his shorter ones. Metamorphosis, most famously, in which the traveling salesman Gregor Samsa wakes up one morning, as I said, to find that he's been transformed into a giant something, beetle, cockroach, some kind of vermin, maybe a rat. There's also Report to an Academy, which is a lecture by an ape telling how after his capture in West Africa, he managed to stop himself from having to perform for the rest of his life as a circus animal by learning to perform, act, and speak like a human being. That's the text that is at the core of both of these two shows. It's also the text that is the core of Coetzee's work in Lives of Animals. How do you learn to be human if you're an ape is one of the questions that all of these texts pose and that Kafka himself asks. How did we learn to be human from being apes? And what are the costs of doing that, both to ourselves and to other animals? Beyond those two famous stories, there's The Burrow, Josephine the Singer, or the Mouse People, extraordinary little story, The Investigations of a Dog, Jackals and Arabs, and Bloomfelt, an elderly black bachelor. Apes, moles, mice, dogs, beetles, birds, horses, jackals, a panther, and a whole range of other animals are all encountered in the pages of Kafka's work, in his letters, his diaries, his notebooks as well. As well as these ordinary animals, Kafka also depicts transformations, not only from human to animal, but also, of course, as we've just said, from animal to human. There's also imaginary hybrids and some strangely indeterminate creatures. In fact, Emily's show, Blizzard, began with investigation of one of Kafka's short stories, Odradek, which has this kind of weird thing that is also like a, well, who knows what Odradek is, but it's something that provokes the worries of the head of a household. It's not quite an animal. It's not quite a ball of string. It's a kind of inanimate, but nonetheless animate being. Kafka's clearly really interested in the limits of human being and in the edges of what we lend or imagine has animacy, has spirit or feeling, but also has agency. In much of his work, animals serve not only as vehicles for the expression of human subjectivity, but rather as investigations into the limits of what we understand by the human. So animals for him are not simply fables in the sort of Aesop or La Fontaine tradition. It's not by when you see a cat, you know that it's going to signify something, or you see a wolf, you know what it signifies, or the lion, or it's not the political animal in that sense that Kafka's largely interested in. Instead, he transposes action from human beings to animals that generate different kinds of structures, different kinds of ways, different ways of being in the world. Of course, you can allegorize much of this estrangement or this othering. In particular, and most powerfully over the last few years, people have allegorized this either in relation to Kafka's various, his understanding of his own disabilities or his understanding of his own Jewishness. Some have also thought of Kafka in relation to his own sexuality as kind of othered in various different ways. But in a way, any one of these allegories is, even though it's necessary for all of us to allegorize at various points, also closes down the openness of the humanimal as a space in which Kafka's thinking about broader questions around the limits of the human. As I said earlier, the report to the Academy is a text that's inspired not only myself and the work that I've been doing with Tony Miambo and with Ed Gochen, but also Coetzee. If you haven't read Lives of Animals already by Coetzee, I would really sort of urge you to do so, because one of the things that he does there is sort of collapses Elizabeth Costello into the figure of Red Peter, the ape in Report to an Academy, and as I say, reorganizes the sort of questions around species into questions around gender, but also into an argument about modern ways of thinking about animals and modern scientific and humanities research. So if you're interested in this question and haven't read Coetzee's work yet, then please do. If you have and have questions about how I might think about it or how we might think about it together, please ask those questions in the Q&A. Finally, then, a few minutes on playing with Kafka, more specifically myself and these two shows. So the show on the left of your screen, I think it's on the left, or there may be the other way around now I think about it, Kafka's Ape. I didn't make this show. All I did, if you like, was brought it to Oxford. I was aware of its existence, and along with Karen Leader, professor in German, we arranged for Tony to come from South Africa, where he lives and works, and to perform this show. What's extraordinary about this show is that it's effectively just an embodiment of Kafka's work. So pretty much everything that Tony says in this show, in this solo show, is Kafka's text translated. But there are two big differences to what he's done. One, he also performs extraordinary physical embodiment. So it's no longer words. It's also an amazing, a truly extraordinary physical embodiment of the transition between an ape and a person, learned through many, many days, in fact, several months of spending time watching apes in the zoo in South Africa, in Johannesburg in particular, where he works, but also in, and this is the second point, when this is performed by a black man such as him, and a black man with the kind of versatility and shape and ability to move that he has, this becomes a different story. It becomes very clearly a story about race. And Tony knows that full well, and that's one of the things that he is working with. And indeed, there are a few changes in the text which make it clear that he thinks it's clear that Kafka is also talking about race, not simply his own Jewishness, but more broadly, the degree to which European culture determines itself as the human and thinks of other races as not fully human, as needing to learn to be as human as they are. So the signs under which I would place Tony's playing with Kafka are those of adaptation, embodiment, and relocation. The ways in which Ed and I directed this show with Ed and co-wrote it with him. The signs under which we work there are inspiration, dislocation, and reimagining. Ed's show is, oops, have you lost the picture there? I've lost my picture, certainly. I'm sorry, I will go back. All right, maybe you don't need the sharing anyway. We'll go back to me for a minute. Okay, just to conclude, Ed's show is it begins not as a lecture, but as a stand-up comedy show. It consists basically of him playing some music and a microphone, and it begins as stand-up comedy. Lots of jokes about himself, about his own life, about his family. He's from a family in the West Country who are of Irish background. It's a story about the Irish in England. Ed makes a very fine living doing voices on the radio and on television, and does an accent coach. In other words, he can become pretty much any voice you want him to do within the British Isles in terms of accents. So part of what you're already seeing in the stand-up is a person who's, if you like, class, national, and other belongings are being confused by the way in which he's able to talk in all these different voices, but also who has a very strong account of himself as coming from an Irish immigrant family, indeed from a Republican family. One of his cousins was one of the hunger strikers who was killed during the hunger strike. And it's about his growing up in Britain with this very strong Republican background and the degree to which he could or couldn't, as a child, acknowledge that background. Now, this is mostly done through comedy. So, for example, in his West Country school, they were asked to bring in photos of anyone in their family in uniform. And of course, he found a picture of his grandfather in an IRA in the regalia of the RA, and his mum said, no, you can't take that in to school. So there's a kind of that doesn't count as the kind of things that this particular place will recognize as a memento of how you belong within this community. So there's moments of comedy like that. But then there's a twist in the show. About halfway through the show, Ed, who does indeed have a hunch, a kind of a bit in his scoliosis, but basically he's got the same thing as Richard III, and he makes a good few gags about that. Goes off to the doctor to try and work out what to do about this sort of not quite monstrous body that he has. They do a DNA test, and they find out from the DNA test that there are results here that they've never met before. And this is where the show takes a different turn, because up until now, you've sort of believed more or less everything that's said because it's within the zone of stand-up. At this point, we discovered that the DNA test revealed that Ed was not fully human. In other words, the DNA suggested that he was only 88.4% human. There was some other DNA that was not recognizable. The doctors had never seen this before. He gets taken off to what he thinks will be the hospital. In fact, he gets taken off to a vet. The vet confirms that he's well, but is not human. He goes home. As soon as he wakes up the next morning, there's a letter from the tax office telling them they've taken away his tax code and that he can't work. And so then, and why can't he work? Well, because there's no interspecies code, and they've now been told that he's not human. So he then has to go to a tribunal to try and demonstrate that he is fully human. And the last 15 minutes of the show is about how would one possibly demonstrate that you are fully human. So he calls on the people who work with him as a musician and try and say, well, surely as a musician, I am fully human. Of course, they remember various other performing animals who can play music in the past. He calls on, so that it becomes increasingly complicated, increasingly comic, but in the end, it's clear that he finds it impossible to argue the case for a distinctive humanity. Now, if I tell you what happens right at the end, I'm ruining the show for you, and this is a show that's still on tour. But hopefully, if I do tell you, you can forget this and then see it again. I always forget what I've seen in the theatre for the most part anyway. Somehow it's alive again. Basically, at the end of the show, the monkey god arrives in a deus ex machina, arrives in the court. Hanuman arrives, various other formations of monkey god arrive and persuade the court that in fact we live in a humanimal world, in a world in which the distinction between the humans and the animals is not the primary distinction, and that Ed should somehow be allowed to continue working as a performer, as a writer, as a comedian, and as a musician, and that the question of his distinctive humanity should simply be suspended while we get on with playing the show and while he gets on with playing his life. In other words, inspiration, dislocation, and reimagining as a way of displacing the question for now, or at least taking it out of a court, out of a lecture, out of an academic space, and putting it into the space of play. Now I'm not suggesting that Words and Music or Ed's show or the show that we made, or indeed Blizzard, which tackles similar themes, that theatre can give us the answer to the question of what makes us fully human. I'm suggesting rather that it's a way of reworking, engaging with a series of questions which run through Kafka's work, but that also run through engagements with animals at least as far back as the early modern period, and of course, much, much earlier. This has been a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but I can see that there are some questions in the chat at least. And I was given instructions to stop about 10 minutes beforehand. So I shall stop now and hope at least that some of this has made some kind of sense. And also maybe that you can see my little Ganesh, who is the elephant god, sat behind me, overseeing my talk as we've spoken. Back to you, Richard.
Well, thanks very much, Wes, for that really very thought-provoking lecture that makes us, our talk that makes us think about so much about the nature of the animal and the human. I mean, we do have some questions at the moment. One of them relates to the human's ability to create what we would call technology. Is this a distinguishing factor from the animal world?
Mm.
And the other relates, interestingly, to the whole business, the genetic business, the human genome, the idea of a specific genome for the different species.
Right. So the genome question is clearly one of the things that we were interested in with words and music. Um, uh, Again, I'm hoping that nobody wants me to give the full answer to this question or to give a definitive answer as to what there's, because in a sense, the whole point of what I'm trying to say is that I, at least, or the work that I'm doing is more about raising questions rather than answering questions. I suppose I would say that what the Genome Project does, and the search for a specifically human set of genetic markers, is in a long tradition of trying to find what it is that makes us specifically human. Um, uh, and the historian in me is enough of a cultural relativist to say, well, at some point, people will go, gosh, did they really think that genes were going to tell them that? In the past, they thought it was going to be this, and then they thought it was going to be that, and then they thought it was genes. How interesting. And in some future moment, our reliance on genetics as a kind of index of who we are and where we come from will seem, I am sure, as curious as our reliance once upon a time on noble blood or on a whole series of other ways of defining lineage, inheritance, and so on. I hope that makes sense as an answer. You're nodding, Richard, so at least it's not. I'm
Yes,
suggesting
yes, I understand. Yes.
yeah. To go then to the technology question. This is interesting. There are uh, large numbers of studies now about uh, um, apes in particular and different kinds of apes, bonobos in particular, let's say, who have technology. In other words, who are able to use sticks, for example, to get inside things, to break them open, to bring the grubs out, to reach. So, Freud's understanding of technology is everything as an extension of our body. Um, uh, Turns into animal studies a lot, whereby apes in particular are, and as I say, bonobos in particular, but also other apes who are similar in genetic structure to ourselves, clearly have or are developing, have long had, but are developing increasingly, an understanding of technology as an extension of the body. We'll go that far. And as a way of managing to reach further, smell further, hear further, take their senses further than would normally be possible. And in fact, the question of invention is one that Montaigne thinks about enormously. And in particular, he looks at a bird's nest and says, we haven't invented anything as complicated as this. And then, of course, there's the spider's web as well as an example. So there are, throughout cultural history, this is a question that we seem to be asking ourselves all the time, and to which people who think about this will either say, well, look, animals do similar things, or else, and then you get a scalar question, or else who will more controversially say, they not only do similar things, they do things far more complicated than we can. So that's how I would answer that question about technology. But it's a good question, and it's an old and worthy question, if you like, that recurs across time.
We have another question here to ask if you ever worked with the late Brian
Ah,
Catling, who was the
if
Ruskin
only.
professor. Yes.
If only. I knew Brian a little bit, and I'd certainly been to a number of his performances where I didn't see the Cyclops performance, but I've seen various other performances where he and his considerable bulk were able to transform into the most powerful monsters. Yes. Performance. So yeah. So the short answer is no, not collaborated, but witnessed, performed, talked to. Yeah, known, but never collaborated. And by the time I really got into the space where I was brave enough to ask him, he was no longer able to do it. But no, he's an inspiration in terms of that sort of solo performance of self-transformation. Yes, Thank you for the
Yes.
question.
But I think that backs up, doesn't it, what you were saying about the importance of the stage in all this, where monsters have to be portrayed by humans,
Yes,
where the human has to become the monster
yes.
on stage, and the borders are blurred as a result of that.
Yes, and that's true, even true in in the new technologies that we have. So I've this
Yeah.
last couple of weeks I've been working on this thing, Fantasy Futures, where there are gargoyles that become alive. Now, in order to
Yeah.
animate those gargoyles, one has to sort of do an Andy Circus, as they say. In other
Yes.
words, put on a suit,
Yeah.
be part of a motion capture thing, and it's still the human who is doing those gestures. So at the moment, even in digital space and even in CGI, computer graphics things, there's still a human doing that transformation work in order for us to be able to recognize it as somehow monstrous. So you're right that not only in live theatre, but even in digitally generated theatre, that seems to be still the case. Yes.
Yes. Thank you. I can't see any other questions coming in just at the moment, but I was interested myself in what you said about Caliban,
Yes.
because I think it's very likely that cannibal lies behind that. But would you agree, I mean, that an anagram is actually quite an interesting thing in that it has another word embedded in it, but it's not that word. By
Absolutely.
giving him a given name as Caliban, it in a sense questions the categorization of him as a cannibal.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. So I mean, that would entirely fit in with what I'm calling playing with.
Yes,
Is that you have a model,
yes,
and instead of just reproducing the model, you play with that model.
yeah,
And there's the, if you like, there's the inheritance. Well, people might know what the model is that you're playing with and carry that into the situation, but it's the shift, it's the new perspective, it's the new shape that model has that becomes most compelling. So yes, I think that's absolutely right. An anagram within poetry is one way of playing with that, but then to, if you like, embody that anagram in a figure
yes, yes,
um,
yeah,
who carries with him all the traces of the wild men of Europe and so on, as well as the traces of the New World peoples, is a very particular genius, a kind of gift that Shakespeare's giving performers, but also giving his audience at the time. Yes, thank you for that.
I'm just looking to see if we have any other questions. We don't at the moment. So perhaps, I mean, as we're approaching 6 o'clock anyway, I could just thank you, Wes, once again for giving us this really enormously thought-provoking talk. And I think it makes us, we all take categories for granted, particularly the human perhaps, but it makes us all think about them much more carefully. So thank you so much indeed for giving us your time today.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to have to rethink this in this particular format. It's actually been a lot of fun to rethink it and been produced a set of new ideas as well. So thank you all.
Well, very enjoyable for us too. Thank you. Goodbye.